We're going to talk about warm and cool season grasses. It's an important thing to talk about here. And when we talk about turf grass, let me share my screen with you. Um, when we talk about these, the first thing we need to mention is that we have these cool versus warm season grasses. We commonly refer to that. We have a transition zone in the middle. Just like people, we have genetic differences. If you took a group of us and put us up in the Arctic, some of us would be more genetically adaptable to that situation than others. Some of us would just die out, probably me. If you took some of us and put us into really warm conditions down in the tropics, again, you're going to have some folks that are going to survive better than others in those situations. Similar with plants, including grasses. We have those that will do well in the north and not do well in the south, and vice versa. Now, if we look at these maps, we have different types of maps out there, and some are just kind of generically talk cool versus warm season, whereas this one is also including humidity. I mean, there's more than just temperature when we start talking about weather and weather tolerance. So we have warm and cool, and we have humid and arid areas. For example, where I live here in Provo, Utah, it's in this cold winter arid zone versus Pennsylvania over here, which is a cold winter humid zone. So we factor these in some cases. It's important for some species. I would like to point out that I see these maps and there's differences, right? Let's look, for example, here in Utah at St. George down here in Southwest Utah. This map on the right is showing that it's just barely in the transition zone, whereas this map on the left is showing a full fourth of the state of Utah in the transition zone. So there's some subtle differences, but you get the idea, right? I mean, cool season grasses grow in the north and warm season grasses grow in the south, and where exactly that line is, there is no exact line. It depends on the year, and the fact is the climate's getting warmer, and this warm season line is creeping northward. And some people get mad when I say the climate's getting warmer, and I was like, well, just look at the blasted thermometers. They don't lie. My data here in Provo shows that it's been getting warmer. And if I think about when I was a student here many years ago, it was cold. I remember one time I was driving to campus and it was so cold, my truck radiator blew just because it was just sub-zero freezing cold. And anyway, last winter, I didn't have to hardly shovel my driveway, hardly any snow, and it was pretty warm. So it's getting warmer. Is it going to keep getting warmer? I don't know. How fast is it going to get warm? I don't know. How much of it's man-made? I don't know. You guys can argue about all that stuff, but the fact is it's getting warmer, and it might continue to do so. If it does, these lines are creeping north, and that's an important thing when you're a turfgrass manager. Now, when we talk about ID, this is just a cool season ID. Similar ones for warm season ones, but one of the first things is deciding whether the grass is cool season versus warm season. One of the greatest keys that I have for that is looking at the ligules. Now, the ligules are these either membranes or these little hairy fibers that exist right at the junction of where the leaf blade, meets the rest of the stem, the stalk. And so cool season grasses tend to have membranous ligules. The warm season grasses tend to have hairy ligules. Now, it's not 100%, but it's a pretty good diagnostic. I really use that a lot in my diagnosing. Sometimes there is no ligule. I'll talk about that in a second. But here you see on the left, you got a cool season grass with some ligules, and there on the right, you see some hairy ligules that are more indicative of the warm season grasses. Let's talk about the cool season grasses. We call these C3 grasses. That references their photosynthetic system, which is important. And it's the reason why they don't do well in the south, is because they have a C3 photosynthetic system. They want to be happy at about 70 degrees Fahrenheit. And the reason is that they're stomata. Now, what is stomata? Stomata are like little mouths that exist on the surface of the leaves, and they allow breathing, so to speak. They allow carbon dioxide to come in. Now, if humans, we want oxygen to come in, carbon dioxide to come out through our mouths. Plants, they need carbon dioxide to come in because that's how they get their food, right? And so those stomates allow that carbon dioxide to come in. But respiration gases and water vapor can escape out of those stomata. And that can be an issue. Now, we want some of that's good. I mean, moving water up and through a plant and out into the atmosphere, that process of transpiration is really important. But if it's excessive water loss is not good for the plant. And that plant will recognize that in those hot temperatures, and it'll close the stomates. And that shuts off photosynthesis, which is a problem. So if I during the middle of the day, if I'm not photosynthesizing, that's a real problem. So that's why these grasses don't do well in the South. They tend to do better in these cold, arid, and cold, humid regions, as well as these mild winter humid areas over here on the west coast of the United States. Okay, if we look here on the left, you've got Kentucky bluegrass. It's the most dominant planted cool season grass there is. And even though I just told you that I use the ligules to diagnose, this is an exception. Kentucky bluegrass has an absent ligule, whereas if you look at the annual bluegrass, you get this really prominent membranous ligule, which is a nice feature to help identify and tell the difference between these two. Kentucky bluegrass, again, most widely used, which means it's the most widely planted cool season turf grass. It's great. It's got very good recuperative abilities. It'll spread through rhizomes, and so it'll kind of fill in if you get some thin spots. It's pretty drought tolerant, even though it does require a lot of water. Now people are like, wait, what are you talking about? What I mean is like if it gets really hot and potentially a little dry, it'll slip into dormancy fairly easily, but it's probably still alive. I have been surprised so many times where I thought for sure, like weeks of brown grass, and I thought that stuff's dead. We put some water on it, and 3 weeks later, it'll pop back out. So when we say drought tolerant, that's what we mean. But to keep it from sliding into dormancy, it takes a lot of water. It also takes a lot of fertilizer relative to some other species. Theoretically, it's poorly shade tolerant. However, as long as it gets a little bit of direct sun during the day, I actually think it does pretty well. For example, I have Kentucky bluegrass in my house. The west side of my house is shaded by my house. And then I have sycamore trees that run along the property of my neighbor's place. And so I only get like 1 or 2 hours of direct sunlight on my bluegrass that's on that side of my house. Does great, does really well. So in my opinion, I've seen lots of situations where as long as I'm getting at least some direct sun, I'm okay. It's when I have shade all day long, it doesn't do well. It gets thin and doesn't do well at all. It wants to be mowed at about 2 inches mowing height. It'll tolerate, like we get some sports turf situations like Real Salt Lake, for example, they're mowing at about 3/4 of an inch. BYU are mowing at about an inch. It doesn't really like it. It'll tolerate it for a while. Eventually it'll need to be replaced. Annual bluegrass now, it is the most widely distributed turfgrass species, and that's not because we're planting it, it's because it's planting itself. It's really good at propagating itself. It grows anywhere there's turfgrass, including the warm season. Even though it's a C3 cool season grass, it actually is very common in the warm season areas. It's very, very resilient. Most of these are winter annuals. Some though are not. They're weak perennials. But when we say winter annual, we mean it germinates in the fall, and then it'll overwinter, and then it'll create seed in sometime in the spring. We've got all sorts of biotypes, though, that do all sorts of things. It will survive really low mowing, 1/10 of an inch. We can mow golf greens every single day, and this stuff will do just fine. That's one of its biggest problems. In fact, it'll start out competing the other grasses that we were trying to grow at that height. Again, when are we doing that? Pretty exclusively golf greens and tee boxes we're mowing at that height. In order to get the golf balls to roll properly, we mow super short. But annual bluegrass will survive that, and it's a pain. It's our biggest problem in sports turf and golf because of that. So we think, well, why not we just grow it? Because it forms these seed heads, and it really is a bunch grass, and so it causes the ball to not roll properly, and it looks ugly too. It's kind of light yellow. So when we compare these two, Kentucky bluegrass and annual bluegrass, they're both POA is their genus, and so they're related. They kind of look similar, but not really. I think it's pretty easy to spot the difference. You'll notice that the Kentucky bluegrass is darker green. Most of the time, the annual bluegrass is a lighter yellow. The Kentucky bluegrass will form some seed heads. Most of the time, not. Once in a while, I'll see some seed heads. If I'm mowing every week, you'll get some seed heads popping up here and there. But annual bluegrass, it'll produce seed heads, and it'll produce them every day. I'm mowing every single day, I'll still get seed heads. Mowing a tenth of an inch, I'll still get seed heads. It's incredible at how good it is at producing seed at a low mowing height. And again, we talked about the ligule thing. When we talk about bluegrasses in general, what a great diagnostic feature, even though they don't have a ligule, but they'll have boat-shaped tips. And so if you think about the hull of a boat, here's a picture of me as a younger man. I'm kidding. But if you think about the hull of a boat there, how that's shaped, when we have these grasses that have that kind of shape like that. Now, if you'll take that grass and you'll run your finger up it, that it'll split and it'll form 2 points. It's very diagnostic and say, okay, I got a bluegrass. I don't know which one. If it's annual versus Kentucky, I can look at the ligule and then I know. There are other bluegrasses out there too that you might need to do, but those two really make up most of what we're dealing with. So again, boat-shaped tips for Kentucky bluegrass. Creeping bentgrass. It's another common cool season grass. It's a very fine texture, which is why we use it on golf greens. It adapted to very low mowing heights. I can mow it at a tenth of an inch. That is very short. That is just a tiny amount. So it's kind of incredible that we can mow it that short and still have it look decent. So anyway, that's why it's used on golf courses, greens, as well as tee boxes. It can be mowed taller, like a ½ inch, like used in fairways. Not my favorite though. I kind of don't like creeping bentgrass if I don't have to use it for some various reasons. It's pretty maintenance intensive. It is cold tolerant. It's also pretty warm season tolerant. I mean, honestly, it's the #1 golf green grass, even in the South in most places. Now there are some others that have Bermudagrass in them, but it's still #1. It's susceptible to desiccation and it's very susceptible to compaction. So, golf greens, tee boxes, lots of traffic. Preferably we build those with USGA spec sand that doesn't compact as easily. And, otherwise we've really got to aerate a lot in order to keep the oxygen in the system with these things. They tend to have shallow roots. Mostly that's related to mowing height. Mowing height is proportional to root depth. The shorter I mow, the shorter my roots. And so we tend to get this species that's already kind of short in terms of its root depth, but then we mow it short, it even makes it worse. I've seen commonly, 1, 2, maybe 3. If I'm 3 inches, I'm pretty happy. I've seen deeper certain times a year, but this stuff is a problem. And that's one of its problems is it's shallow rooted. When we want to look at annual bluegrass versus creeping bentgrass, and again, annual bluegrass is my biggest problem in sports turf and golf greens. And so I frequently have annual bluegrass. I always have annual bluegrass in my creeping bentgrass greens. So one way to tell the difference, usually I can see the difference. Now creeping bentgrass is lighter color than maybe Kentucky bluegrass, but the annual bluegrass is still even lighter yellow. And so it's pretty easy to kind of see these spots of annual bluegrass out there. The seed heads is also diagnostic, but another good diagnostic is I get folded vernation. Again, at this junction between the blade and the rest of the stem, where I have new tissue that's growing. That's what we, if you took some scissors and cut that, you would see this folded vernation for the annual bluegrass versus the creeping bentgrass would be the rolled. And here's a picture of that. Okay, tall fescue, another very common cool season grass. It's really pretty good in a lot of ways. Got good wear tolerance, heat tolerance, drought tolerance, fairly shade tolerant, unlike Kentucky bluegrass. It doesn't do great in the cold, although with the climate getting warmer, frankly, I see tall fescue in the northernmost reaches of the United States. But in theory, it's less cold tolerant than some others. It's kind of got a reputation for having a coarse texture, although we have turf types that have been bred to not be that way. Its biggest problem, frankly, is it's a bunch type grass, which means it's not very conducive to sod. If you have sod, you have to put a netting on it to kind of help it hold it together, because like Kentucky bluegrass has got rhizomes that'll help kind of hold it together as sod. With these bunch grasses, they're just individual plants, they're not all tied together. And so it makes sod not very good. And also, if it gets thin, like this grass here, you can see some thin spots, it doesn't fill in very well because of that bunch type growth. Whereas if that was Kentucky bluegrass, that would send rhizomes out and it would make new daughter plants in those bare spots. So Kentucky or tall fescue is not great. It requires overseeding to keep it a full canopy. Some of these new types don't have auricles or ligules, whereas the older versions do. So that's an important diagnostic thing to realize, is that we do have some differences. These grasses, tall fescue, tend to do pretty well in the transition zone. Like I used to live in Manhattan, Kansas, where I got my PhD, right there at the top of the transition zone. And, you get some brutal winters and some really hot summers. Tall fescue tends to do okay. I had a tall fescue lawn when I lived in Manhattan. Ryegrass is another cool season grass, very common. The best feature about these is that they germinate really quickly and they establish quickly. And that's in contrast to Kentucky bluegrass. Kentucky bluegrass is painfully slow to germinate and slow to get established. It takes months before it really looks good and filled in. Whereas ryegrass, it'll germinate in about 4 to 5 days and it'll look full in just, a couple of weeks. So therefore, we often use it as a nurse crop when we're planting other species such as Kentucky bluegrass. Like tall fescue and annual bluegrass, it's a bunch type grass. It's pretty susceptible to winter kill, which makes it not a great grass. It is used in warm season areas as a winter cover. I'll talk about that more here in just a second. But overall, not a great turf grass. Again, it's got its place as a nurse crop, but that's mostly what it's used for overseeding and nurse crop. Here's an example of what I talk about with overseeding. The Las Vegas Raiders Allegiant Stadium. This is Bermudagrass, which is a warm season grass. I'll talk about it here in a minute. It's a great sports turf. It ties in really good. This grass is actually grown outside and then rolled into the stadium, which is kind of cool. Same thing down at the Arizona Cardinals. But the problem with this Bermuda grass is that this is professional football, and this will go dormant and turn brown before the football season is over. And so end of December, January, it's going to be brown and not looking great. Well, fans and the crazy people we are, sports worshipers, want green grass. And so what we'll do is we'll overseed with perennial ryegrass, which will establish itself amongst the Bermuda grass, and it'll give the grass. And so the players are still playing on the Bermuda grass that's tied together well, but we've got the green grass there. Now, then the next year, summer, the heat, we also have some chemicals that we can use to try to take it out. But it'll kind of die out. I say that, and I wish it worked as good as I said, because most of the time it's really a problem actually to try to completely get that perennial ryegrass out of there in the next summer, which is what we want to do. In terms of a diagnostic, sometimes we also have perennial ryegrass. We also have annual ryegrass. Vernation is another key to identifying, separating these two. The ryegrass perennial has got folded and the annual's got rolled. They also look pretty different. The annual is more coarse and it's kind of ugly. The perennial ryegrass is really, very thin grass, very pointed tips. It's kind of a shiny gloss to it. Pretty distinctive between this and most other species. We talk about the fine fescues. We mentioned tall fescue. Now we're talking about fine fescues. The whole reason these things are used is shade. They don't require much nitrogen. They're often used in combination with other species such as Kentucky bluegrass for shade tolerance. Like if you go buy a shade mix down at the Home Depot, Walmart, Lowe's, whatever, it's probably got fine fescues in it if it's for the cool season area. But it's very susceptible to excessive moisture, which is a problem because a lot of times we start a landscape, we got our irrigation system in, and then over time the trees grow when the shade comes in, and we don't adjust our irrigation system. And so we're still putting on the same amount of water initially as we did initially. And so these shaded areas have less sunlight that is causing evapotranspiration, and we're getting the same amount of water. And so it's really a problem, and the irrigation needs to be adjusted on these areas, or you're going to have problems with these fine fescues. The creeping red cultivars are ones that we want to use in the humid areas, and the chewings and hards are the ones we would typically use in places that are more arid, such as here in Utah. Now, it's kind of interesting. These fescues and ryegrasses, not all of them, some of them have what we call endophytic fungi, which is a symbiotic relationship between this fungus and the plant. I mean, not all fungus is bad. In fact, most microbes are good. But this is one example of this good relationship. The fungus feeds off of the grass, so the grass is providing some nutrients and whatnot. But the fungus is helping with disease and insect resistance, as well as more vigorous plants and stress tolerance. So that's kind of a cool thing. We'd like to get this into Kentucky bluegrass and some other things. People are working on that, but right now it's pretty well limited to these guys. Let's switch over and talk about warm season grasses. We are talking about C4 grasses in contrast to C3 cool season. C4 grasses tend to be doing pretty well at pretty hot temperatures, upwards of 100 degrees. The photosynthetic system allows them to relocate the carbon dioxide during photosynthesis in order to reduce photorespiration. So in other words, I can keep those stomata open and not lose all my water. It's more efficient. And that's the whole reason why these things are adapted to the South. Again, these things will want to survive in these hot, summer humid, as well as arid zone regions, as well as even the tropical areas. Bermudagrass is the most common one. It's a great grass. I love it. It's got lots of great properties. It will tolerate very low mowing. In fact, you'll even see it on golf greens. Not quite as low as creeping bentgrass, but pretty close. It has a very prostrate growth when it's mowed short. It doesn't do well in the shade. It's susceptible to cold. It'll turn dormant. Now, I say that, and I want to put a caveat, because I'll tell you, every summer I plant all of the warm season grasses, the common ones anyway. I plant them in my demonstration plots so that I can use them, so my turfgrass science students can see them in person instead of just having to look at pictures. And it's interesting. I've been doing that for about 15 years, and every winter they all die out except for a couple. Buffalo grass will sort of survive, but it's pretty spotty. It'll get some winter kill, and plus buffalo grass is just ugly. You know, I don't want that as my grass. It's kind of a gray, looks sick. But Bermudagrass, I've never had any winter kill. It'll survive the whole winter. Again, it's cold susceptible. It'll go dormant, but it will survive the winter. That's been my experience in Provo, Utah. And we've seen that in other places too. It's especially important as we're moving north. In fact, we're doing research right now looking at this whole thing of should we be growing these warm season grasses in Provo, Utah? The ones that are survive because they'll use less water is our theory. So we're doing some research on that, and very optimistic that's maybe the thing that we need to be doing. One other big difference here with Bermudagrass. So it's important to realize that there's common Bermudagrass, which is more of like a pasture type of a grass. It is used for turf, but it's not a good one. In fact, in Utah, it's considered a noxious weed. We're trying to help Department of Ag folks understand that hybrid Bermudagrass is a turf grass. It doesn't spread by seed. It'll form seeds, but those seeds are not viable because of their hybridization process. So we can't grow these hybrid Bermudagrasses by seed. So instead, we take some of the grass and we pick it up. We pick up the stolons and even the rhizomes, and we chop them up potentially, and we spread them out. And every one of those nodes from those stolons and rhizomes will potentially form a new daughter plant. So that's when we say vegetatively propagated. That's what we're saying is using that instead of seed. Zoysiagrass is another very popular warm season grass. It's really awesome. It's more cold tolerant theoretically. Not in Provo, Utah. The textbooks say this. It is grown in the transition zone, but my Zoysiagrass pretty much dies out. I'll get a little bit, but survive over the winter, but it's pretty spotty looking. Now we're looking at new varieties. I've been kind of challenged on this. suggesting that maybe I'm not using the right varieties, and that could be true. So we're doing research on that one too. It's possible Zoysiagrass is going to be something we're going to be using in northern climates if we find the right varieties. Very high quality turf, looks great. It is slow to recover from injury, so it's not a great sports turf. But it does stand up really well to disease, insects, traffic, drought, salinity. It's got a lot of great properties. And also, though, it doesn't mow well at short heights. So again, not a great sports turf, but for my lawn, maybe someday I'm going to be having Zoysiagrass out here instead of Kentucky bluegrass. Now, telling the difference between these two, they have a lot of similarities. They look pretty similar. One of the best things, again, is vernation. It's folded for Bermudagrass, rolled for Zoysiagrass. The last one I'll talk about today, there's a whole bunch more varieties, or species of grasses. I've just kind of focused on the main ones. Frankly, 99% of what I run into are these guys, the ones that I've talked about today. The last one here is St. Augustine grass, very limited in scope. It is a very coarse looking grass. It's susceptible to cold and drought, but it is really shade tolerant. But it's only found in these kind of subtropical areas in Florida and Louisiana and the east coast of Texas, etc. I try to grow it every year in Provo. Sometimes I can't even get it established, even in the summer. I don't think it likes our humidity at all. It needs that humid, hot conditions. Hot is not enough. It needs humidity too, because I just can't get it to survive, even to show my students. I can sometimes get it to survive in my greenhouse if I really crank the temperature up and keep it humid in there. Well, I hope that was interesting. These are some cool grasses. Again, I think it's important to understand our grasses and where we want to apply them and how to identify them. Thank you.